The wind in the Arizona territory was a thief. It stole the moisture from the soil, leaving behind a cracked, red raw earth that bled dust with every gust. It stripped the leaves from the cottonwoods, leaving their branches skeletal and clawing at a bleached white sky. And it stole the hope from the faces of men, etching lines of hardship and despair around their eyes and mouths. This was a land of brutal honesty, a place where survival was a daily sacrament, and mercy was a word spoken only in the hushed confines of a church that baked under the relentless sun. For Emma Hayes, this land had taken everything. It had taken the life from her mother, who withered from a fever the doctor was too late to treat. It had taken the spirit from her father, Silas, who drowned his sorrows in cheap whiskey, his laughter growing as hollow as the family's coffers. And now, it was about to take her. The news came not as a thunderclap, but as a dull, sickening thud in the pit of her stomach. Her father, his hands trembling and his breath sour with spirits, had confessed his ruin. The ranch was mortgaged to the hilt, the cattle were sold, and the debt he owed to the mercantile was a mountain he could never hope to climb. But there had been an offer, a way out. "He's a good man, Emma," Silas had slurred, unable to meet her gaze. "A war hero, they say, owns that hole spread up on Whisperwind Ridge, the biggest in the county." Emma's blood ran cold. She knew who lived on Whisperwind Ridge. Everyone did. A man who was spoken of in whispers, a figure of both pity and fear, a cripple. "You mean Caleb Blackwood?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. The name felt like a curse on her tongue. "He needs a wife," Silas mumbled, staring into his empty glass as if it held all the answers. "A woman to run the house. He's willing to clear all my debts, every last cent. We'll be free. Emma, a new start." He was not talking about *them*. He was talking about *him*. The price of his freedom was her life, her dreams of marrying a kind young man, of having children who would laugh in the sun, of a life filled with simple joys. All of it was being traded for a ledger book full of black ink. The town, of course, found out within a day. News traveled faster than wildfire in their small, dusty community. The whispers followed her down the main street, clinging to her like burrs. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, gave her a pitying look over a sack of flour. "Such a brave girl," she'd said, her voice oozing a sympathy that felt more like a condemnation. Two old ranchers talking by the saloon fell silent as she passed, their eyes lingering on her with a morbid curiosity, as if she were a lamb being led to slaughter. They saw her not as a bride, but as a sacrifice, the offering made to the beast on the hill. The man, they said, was as broken in spirit as he was in body. They said he was fierce, foul-tempered, a man who had walled himself off from the world after the mine explosion that had shattered his leg and, by all accounts, his soul. Emma packed her single trunk in a daze. She folded her mother's worn dress, her only nice one, and placed it on top. She tried to be strong, to hold her head high, but fear was a cold, constant companion. It sat in her chest, a heavy stone that made each breath an effort. She would do her duty. She would be a wife to this man, run his house, and honor the bargain her father had made. But in the quietest corners of her heart, a desperate plan began to form. She would endure. She would wait for an opportunity, and then she would leave. She would not be shackled to a monster for the rest of her days. The day of her departure arrived with a sky the color of rust. A rickety buckboard, sent by Mr. Blackwood, stood waiting. Her father, sober for once, looked frail and old. He tried to hug her, but she stood stiff in his arms, the scent of stale whiskey a final, bitter reminder of his betrayal. She offered no tears, no words of forgiveness. She simply climbed onto the hard wooden seat, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the long, winding road ahead. The journey to Whisperwind Ridge was a slow ascent into isolation. The dusty track left the sparse civilization of the town behind. Climbing through sun-scorched hills dotted with juniper and sage, the air grew thinner, the silence deeper. broken only by the creak of the wheels and the weary sighs of the horses. Dust, fine as red powder, coated her dress, her hair, and the back of her throat. With every mile, she felt the world she knew shrinking behind her, and the terrifying unknown looming larger ahead. The ranch house came into view abruptly. It was not a grand estate, but a sturdy, unadorned structure of dark timber, sitting starkly against the vast, empty sky. It looked strong, solitary, and utterly devoid of warmth. A large barn stood nearby, its wood weathered to a silver gray. There was no garden, no sign of a woman's touch, only wind, rock, and wood. As the buckboard creaked to a halt, the front door of the house opened. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than any man she'd ever seen. The worn fabric of his shirt stretched taut across a powerful chest and back. But the image of strength was violently contradicted by his gait. He dragged his left leg, each step a heavy, labored effort. He didn't use a crutch or a cane, as if scorning any admission of weakness. But the struggle was plain to see. This was Caleb Blackwood. He stopped at the edge of the porch, his face shadowed by the brim of a stained hat. Emma could not see his features clearly, but she felt his eyes on her, and they were as cold and hard as the rocky ground beneath her feet. There was no greeting, no word of welcome. He just stood there, a silent, imposing figure, his stillness more intimidating than any shout. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was him, her husband. A circuit preacher had been summoned. He was a gaunt man with a tired face who seemed eager to be done with the business. The ceremony was conducted on the porch as the sun began its fiery descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange, purple, and blood red. There were no guests, no flowers, no music. Emma's only attendants were the whispering wind and the swirling dust. She stood beside Caleb, acutely aware of the space between them, a chasm of silence and resentment. She did not dare to look at him. She stared at the preacher's worn Bible, her own hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Caleb did not move. He did not kiss her. He did not even look at her. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, and pressed them into the preacher's hand. The man nodded, mounted his horse, and rode away without a backward glance, leaving them alone in the dying light. The silence that followed was immense. It stretched and echoed in the vast emptiness of the landscape. Finally, Caleb turned, his mismatched steps thudding on the wooden planks of the porch. He gestured with his head toward the open front door. It was a command, not an invitation, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat. Emma walked past him into the house. The interior was as stark as the outside. It was clean, meticulously so, but furnished with only the barest necessities: a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace swept clean of ash, and a few shelves holding tins and supplies. It was a place for survival, not living. He followed her in, the sound of his dragging leg a grim punctuation in the silence. He lit a single lantern, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. His face was finally clear in the flickering light. It was a strong face, with a square jaw covered in dark stubble and high cheekbones, but his eyes were guarded, and a deep line was carved between his brows. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and then pointed to a closed door. "That's your room," he said. His voice was a low, rough baritone, rusty from disuse. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, closing the door firmly behind him. Emma stood frozen, listening. She heard his heavy, uneven footsteps cross the porch. A moment later, she heard the groan of the large barn door sliding open, then closing again with a final, definitive thud. She was alone. The realization washed over her, a strange and dizzying mix of profound relief and utter desolation. He wasn't going to touch her. He wasn't going to force himself on her. He had chosen the barn, the company of his animals, over the bed of his new wife. The insult was as sharp as a knife. Yet it was also her salvation, at least for this night. She slowly walked to the room he had indicated and pushed the door open. Inside was a simple bed with a clean but coarse blanket, a small washstand, and a window that looked out into the endless, gathering darkness. There was nothing else. She sank onto the edge of the mattress, the silence of the house pressing in on her. And for the first time since hearing the news, Emma Hayes, now Emma Blackwood, allowed herself to weep. The days on Whisperwind Ridge bled into one another, each marked by the same relentless sun and the same bone-weary labor. Life here was stripped to its rawest elements: wind, dust, work, and silence. The well was shallow, and the water Emma hauled up each morning in heavy wooden buckets had a mineral tang. Food was scarce and simple: salted pork, beans, and the tough, stringy jackrabbits Caleb occasionally brought back from his traps. The land itself was a stubborn adversary, a parched, cracked earth that begrudged every attempt to cultivate it. This was not a life of gentle domesticity. It was a daily battle for existence. Emma felt herself changing. The soft skin of her hands grew calloused and rough. Her back, once accustomed to little more than needlework, now ached with the satisfying pain of real work. She learned the rhythms of the ranch not from her husband's instruction, but from observation and necessity. She tended the small kitchen, learning to make their meager supplies last. She fed and watered the 2 sturdy horses in the barn, their soft wickers a welcome sound in the oppressive silence. When a section of the corral fence splintered, she found the tools in the barn and, through clumsy, frustrating effort, managed to secure the rails. She found an old, rust-pitted axe and taught herself to split firewood, the sharp crack of the wood a small victory against the vast quiet. She was no longer just the town girl who had been sold. She was becoming a woman of the West, forged in the crucible of its hardship. Of Caleb, she saw little. He was a phantom in his own home. He rose before the sun had even hinted at its arrival, the quiet scrape of his boot and the heavy thud of his dragging leg the only sign of his passing. When Emma entered the kitchen, a plate of food from the night before would be gone, and he would already be out on the range. He returned long after sunset, a silhouette of exhaustion against the twilight. He would eat the dinner she left for him on the stove, take his plate to the wash basin, and then retreat to the barn without a word. They were 2 ghosts haunting the same space, their lives running on parallel tracks that never seemed to intersect. She saw the toll the work took on him. Sometimes he'd come back with his knuckles raw and bleeding from wrestling with barbed wire, or with a dark, sprawling bruise on his arm where a spooked steer had kicked him. He never complained, never made a sound of pain. He would simply wash the blood away at the pump, his movements stiff, and disappear into the barn. His silence was a wall, and she had no idea how to breach it. He worked as if he were punishing himself, his relentless labor a penance for a sin she couldn't name. One sweltering evening, weeks into her new life, she saw the truth of his pain. She had gone to the well for a final bucket of cool water, thinking he was still out on the far pastures. But he was there, standing at the horse trough, stripped to the waist in the moonlight. He was using a rag to wash the dust and sweat from his body. And, for a moment, Emma froze in the shadows, unable to look away. His back was a terrible road map of old pain. A thick, puckered scar, wide as her hand, ran diagonally from his right hip all the way up to his left shoulder blade, the skin shiny and mangled. It was the kind of wound that should have killed a man, but it was his left leg that stole her breath. From the knee down, it was a ruin of crisscross scars and unnaturally rigid muscle. It wasn't just a limp. It was a testament to an explosion, a limb that had been torn apart and had somehow, impossibly, been pieced back together. She suddenly understood. This wasn't just a man with a bad leg. This was a man who was living in the wreckage of a single, catastrophic moment. A man who had, according to the very people who now scorned him, earned these wounds while saving them. In that instant, the monster from the town's gossip vanished. She saw only a man, terribly wounded, who bore his agony with a silence that was more profound than any scream. She backed away quietly, her heart pounding, and returned to the house. She looked at him differently after that. She began to see not the limp, but the incredible strength it took for him to haul himself into the saddle each morning. She saw not the cold silence, but the iron will of a man who refused to be broken. Her first trip back into town was a necessity. They were low on flour and salt. As she guided the buckboard down the winding road, a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The town felt alien to her now. The whispers started the moment she tied the horses to the hitching post outside the mercantile. This time, they were not just looks of pity, but of a cruel, prodding curiosity. It was Mrs. Gable who dared to speak the words aloud. Emma was counting out her coins for the flour when the baker's wife approached, her face a mask of false concern. "My dear Emma," she said, her voice loud enough for half the store to hear. "It is good to see you. We've all been so worried. It must be difficult." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You are a truly courageous woman to be sleeping with that monster." Something inside Emma snapped. The fear and shame she had carried for weeks suddenly burned away, replaced by a cold, protective anger. She looked Mrs. Gable directly in the eye. "His name is Caleb," she said, her voice low and steady. "And he is my husband? I'd thank you to remember that." She gathered her things, her hands trembling slightly, and walked out of the store, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a tumultuous mix of emotions, but for the first time, she felt a strange, fierce loyalty to the man on the hill. He and she were outcasts together. The storm came a week later, with the sudden, violent fury of the desert. The sky turned a bruised purple-black in the middle of the afternoon. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the house and flinging dust and debris against the windows. Caleb had managed to get the horses into the barn just before the heavens opened up, unleashing a torrent of rain that hammered against the roof like 1,000 fists. They were trapped in the house together, the roar of the storm making speech impossible. And then came a sound like the world splitting apart, a horrific shriek of tortured wood followed by a deafening crash. A section of the roof over the main room had been torn clean off. Wind and rain blasted into the house, overturning the table and sending their meager possessions flying. For a moment, they just stared at the gaping hole, at the violent sky beyond. Then Caleb moved. He grabbed Emma's arm, his grip surprisingly firm, and pulled her toward the relative safety of the kitchen. "The tarp!" he yelled over the din, pointing toward the barn. "In the back!" There was no time for fear. Emma nodded, pulling her shawl over her head and plunging out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, and the rain was a cold, blinding sheet. She fought her way to the barn, found the heavy, oiled canvas tarp, and began the agonizing struggle of dragging it back to the house. Caleb met her halfway, taking the bulk of the weight. Together, they battled their way back inside. What followed was a desperate, chaotic hour. They fought to drag the heavy, waterlogged tarp over the hole in the roof, the wind fighting them every inch, threatening to rip it from their grasp and send them flying. They had to work together, a frantic, unspoken ballet of instinct and necessity. He would brace his good leg, a pillar of strength, while she pulled a corner taut. She would hold a rope steady while he hammered a nail with desperate, furious blows. They were soaked to the skin, shivering, their muscles screaming in protest. Finally, it was done. The tarp was secured, a makeshift patch against the storm's fury. The wind still howled, but the deluge pouring into their home had slowed to a persistent trickle. They stood in the middle of the wrecked room, water pooling at their feet, chests heaving from the exertion. The lantern on the kitchen counter cast a single, flickering light, illuminating the devastation. In that quiet, exhausted aftermath. Their eyes met. It was the first time they had ever truly looked at each other. There was no fear in her gaze now, and no coldness in the dim, flickering light. She saw not the cripple or the monster, but a man, exhausted, beleaguered, but resolute. And he saw not the girl who had been sold to him, the unwelcome presence in his house, but a woman, strong and soaked and shivering, who had fought beside him to save their home. In that shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them. They were not husband and wife, not yet, but they were two survivors, alone on a windswept hill, who had just weathered the same storm together, and for the first time, the silence between them was not empty. It was full of the unspoken truth of what they had just endured. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. It had broken more than just the roof. It had broken the suffocating silence that had defined their existence. A fragile truce had been forged in the chaos, and in the days that followed, Emma found the courage to test its boundaries. The work of repairing the house was hard, but it was work they did together, a shared purpose that created a new, unspoken rhythm between them. She started with small gestures. One evening, as Caleb sat at the table meticulously cleaning his rifle, his brow furrowed in concentration, she brewed a pot of strong, bitter coffee, sweetened with a precious spoonful of molasses. She placed a steaming mug on the table beside him. He flinched, his head snapping up, his eyes immediately guarded. For a long moment, he just stared at the mug as if it were a coiled snake. "I don't need that," he grumbled, his voice a low rasp. Emma's heart sank, but she held her ground. "It's cold out," she said softly, not looking at him, busying herself by wiping down the already clean countertop. "It'll warm you." She expected him to push it away or simply ignore it, but after a minute of tense silence, she heard the soft scrape of the ceramic mug against the wooden table. From the corner of her eye, she saw his large, calloused hand wrap around it, his knuckles white. He took a slow, hesitant sip. He said nothing more, but he drank all of it, and the small act felt like a monumental victory. Buoyed by this, she grew bolder. A few days later, while they were replacing a rotted plank on the porch, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the night she'd seen his back in the moonlight. "Your leg," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her hands stilling on the hammer she held. "The townspeople, they said it happened in the Silver Creek mine explosion, the one that caved in the West Tunnel." His entire body went rigid. The saw in his hand stopped mid-stroke. He didn't look at her, but she saw a muscle clench in his jaw. "The townspeople talk too much," he said, his voice flat and cold. A clear dismissal. He resumed his sawing, the teeth of the blade ripping through the wood with a renewed, angry vigor that said the conversation was over. Emma felt a familiar sting of rejection, but this time it was different. She had seen the flicker of pain in his eyes before the shutters came down. It wasn't just anger. It was a deep, ancient wound she had accidentally touched. He was pushing her away, but she was beginning to understand that his gruffness was a shield, not a sword. The next morning, he surprised her, as she was kneading dough for their daily bread. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his shadow falling long across the floor. "The north herd is drifting," he announced without preamble. "The grass is thin. They need to be moved to the basin. You're coming." It wasn't a request. Emma stared at him, her hands white with flour. She had never ridden out with him, had never been invited into that part of his world. She nodded, her heart giving a nervous flutter. Riding beside him was a revelation. Once in the saddle, Caleb seemed a different man. The crippling awkwardness of his walk was gone, replaced by a fluid, confident grace. On horseback, he was whole. He rode with an easy command, his body moving in perfect sync with the powerful animal beneath him. For the first time, Emma saw a glimpse of the man he must have been before the explosion. The town hero, the strong, capable rancher. He was still a man of few words, but out here, under the vast, open sky, his words had weight and purpose. He taught her how to read the subtle signs of the cattle, how to anticipate their movements. He showed her how to use the horizon as a guide, how to find water by following the lines of the cottonwood trees. He pointed to a faint, feathery wisp of a cloud in the west. "Mare's tails," he said. "Means wind and rain in 2 days. We'll need to check the roof patch." She listened, absorbing every word. She saw the land through his eyes, not as a barren wasteland, but as a living thing, full of secrets and signs for those who knew how to look. In the shared work, a new kind of intimacy grew between them, built on the solid foundation of mutual respect. He was the teacher. She was the student. And in that simple exchange, they found a way to be together without the crushing weight of their arrangement. The peace was shattered a week later. He had gone out after dusk to check on a newborn calf, taking his rifle with him. Emma had waited, the stew on the stove growing cold, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The sound, when it came, was faint but unmistakable, a single, sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed by a chorus of high, hungry yelps. Wolves. She grabbed the lantern and ran outside, her heart pounding. She called his name, her voice thin and reedy against the vast darkness. There was no answer. She started toward the sound, stumbling over the uneven ground, the lantern light dancing frantically. She found him halfway to the far pasture. He was on his feet, leaning heavily against a rocky outcrop, his rifle still clutched in his hand. A large, gray wolf lay dead at his feet. But it was Caleb's condition that made her gasp. His left arm was a mess of torn fabric and blood. Another gash, deep and vicious, ran down the length of his right thigh, his good leg. "Caleb!" she cried, rushing to his side. "Just a scratch," he grunted, his face pale and beaded with sweat in the lantern light. But as he tried to take a step, his good leg buckled, and he would have fallen if she hadn't been there to catch him. Getting him back to the house was a nightmare. He was a heavy man, and with his good leg injured, he was almost dead weight. She half dragged, half carried him, his arm draped over her shoulders, his breathing coming in ragged, painful gasps. By the time they reached the porch, they were both trembling with exhaustion. She got him into his own bed for the first time, a simple cot in a sparse room off the kitchen that she had never dared to enter. She lit every lantern she could find and gently cut away the torn, blood-soaked fabric. The wounds were worse than she had feared. The bite on his arm was deep, but the gash on his leg was a long, ragged tear, bleeding sluggishly. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, pushing down her fear. She washed the wounds with carbolic soap and hot water, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He bore it all with a stoic, frightening silence. His jaw clenched, his eyes squeezed shut. She stitched the gash on his leg closed with a needle and thread from her sewing kit, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. She bandaged the wounds tightly with strips of clean linen and forced him to drink a bitter tea of willow bark for the pain and fever she knew would come. And it did come. By midnight, he was burning up. He tossed and turned on the narrow cot, his powerful body racked with shivers. The fever stripped away his iron control, and he began to mutter, his words slurred and nonsensical. Emma sat by his side in a low chair, bathing his face with a cool, damp cloth, listening to the fragments of his tormented soul. He spoke of rock and dust, of the smell of blasting powder and the darkness of the earth. He cried out orders to men she didn't know, and then one name, over and over, a desperate, broken plea. "Joseph! Joseph! Get back! The fuse is short! Joseph! No!" The name hit her like a physical blow. Joseph, the town gossip, cruel as it was, had been thorough. Caleb Blackwood had gone into that mine with his younger brother. Joseph, only Caleb had come out. She finally understood. It wasn't just the leg. It wasn't just the scars. It was this. He wasn't living with a crippled limb. He was living with a crippled soul, crushed under the weight of a guilt so immense it had driven him from the world. The mine hadn't just taken his leg and his brother. It had taken his future, his hope, his belief that he deserved to live. He thrashed again, his one good hand flailing, his eyes wide with an unseen horror. My fault, all my fault. Should have been me, Joseph. Tears streamed down Emma's face, hot and silent. Her own hardships, her own lonely fears, seemed so small in the face of his profound agony. Without thinking, she moved from the chair to the edge of the cot. She reached out and took his flailing hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. Then, she did something she never would have dared before. She leaned over and gently, carefully, wrapped her arms around his trembling shoulders, pulling his head toward her until it rested against her chest. She held him, rocking him gently as she would a frightened child, murmuring soft, soothing words. Shh, it's all right. Caleb, I'm here. It's all right. He stilled instantly. The frantic energy seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a dead, heavy weight. For a long moment, he remained completely motionless, his breathing ragged against her shoulder. Then, she felt a shudder run through his entire body. He gave a single, ragged sigh, a sound of such utter weariness and surrender that it broke her heart, and for the first time in 10 long, lonely years. Caleb Blackwood rested his head on another's shoulder and allowed himself to be held. He said nothing, but in the quiet dark of the room, with the smell of blood and fever in the air, she felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble into dust. The fever broke, leaving Caleb weak but lucid. The long, slow process of healing began, and as his body mended, so too did the fractured silence between them. He never spoke of the night of his fever, of the name he'd cried out, but something had irrevocably shifted. The wall between them had been breached, and in its place, a fragile, unspoken tenderness began to grow. His eyes no longer held the cold, hard glint of a stranger. They followed her now, with a quiet, watchful intensity that was no longer intimidating. Then the first snow came. It fell silently in the night, a thick white blanket that transformed the harsh, red dust world into a place of stunning, pristine beauty. The isolation of Whisperwind Ridge became absolute. The road to town vanished, and the world shrank to the dimensions of their small cabin, the barn, and the vast, white expanse that surrounded them. They were utterly alone. 2 souls marooned on a sea of snow. Winter forced them into a new kind of partnership, a pact for survival against the cold. Their days became a shared rhythm of essential tasks. Each morning, they would brave the biting wind together to break the ice on the water trough for the horses and cattle. They spent hours with a 2-man saw, its rhythmic asterisk, shush, 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 asterisk, the only sound in the silent forest as they felled dead pines for firewood. The work was grueling, but in the shared effort, in the steam of their breath mingling in the frigid air, they found a simple, profound companionship. They were no longer the cripple and his purchased bride. They were 2 people fighting the same elemental battle, depending wholly on one another to see the sun rise on another day. One afternoon, with the wind howling outside, Caleb took down the heavy rifle from its pegs over the fireplace. "You need to learn," he said, his tone matter of fact. "If I'm laid up or away from the house, you need to be able to protect yourself." He took her out behind the barn, into the deep, muffling silence of the snow. The cold air stung her cheeks. He showed her how to load the cartridges, how the mechanism worked, his large hands surprisingly deft. Then, he moved to stand behind her, positioning her to aim at an old tin can he'd placed on a fence post. "Plant your feet," he instructed, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "Lean into it. It's got a kick." He reached around her to help her steady the long, heavy barrel. His chest was pressed against her back, and she could feel the solid warmth of him through her thick wool coat. His left hand covered hers on the forestock of the rifle, his thumb brushing against her knuckles, and she felt it. a fine, almost imperceptible tremor running through his hand. It wasn't the shaking of a man crippled by injury, but the subtle, betraying tremble of a man unaccustomed to the simple touch of another human being. The realization sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Breathe out slow," he murmured, his breath stirring her hair, "and squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She did as he said. The rifle exploded with a deafening crack, bucking hard against her shoulder. The tin can flew off the post and disappeared into a snowbank. A startled laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure, surprised delight. She turned to look up at him, her face flushed with excitement, and found him already looking down at her, a strange, soft expression in his eyes she had never seen before. He quickly looked away, but not before she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. The nights were the most intimate, trapped by the weather. They spent the long, dark hours by the hearth. The fire crackled and spat, casting a warm, golden glow over the rustic room. One evening, Emma mulled some of the hard cider she'd found in the root cellar, filling the cabin with a sweet, spicy scent of apples and cinnamon. She handed a warm mug to Caleb, who had settled into a chair by the fire, his injured leg propped up on a stool. The warm drink and the hypnotic dance of the flames seemed to loosen his tongue. For the first time, they spoke not of chores or the weather, but of the past. Emma told him about her mother, about her love for books and her quiet dream of one day seeing the ocean. He listened, his gaze fixed on the fire, his silence no longer empty, but full of a deep, attentive quality. Then, hesitantly, he began to speak. He told her about growing up on this very land, about learning to ride before he could properly walk. He spoke of his brother, Joseph, his voice softening with a sad, gentle nostalgia. He described a mischievous boy who could charm the birds from the trees, a boy who had followed him everywhere. He spoke of their shared dream to one day have the finest ranch in the territory. He spoke of a life before, a life when he was whole, and his stories painted a picture of a man she was only just beginning to know. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and a comfortable silence had settled between them. The only sound was the sighing of the wind outside. It was Caleb who broke it. He turned his head and looked directly at her, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet and raw, "if you could leave, if the roads were clear and you had a place to go, would you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. It was the question that lay beneath every shared glance, every moment of their strange, evolving life together. He was offering her an escape, asking her if she was still his prisoner. Her heart clenched. A few months ago, the answer would have been an immediate, desperate yes, but now the thought of leaving this cabin, this harsh and beautiful land, this broken and gentle man, sent a pang of desolation through her. She couldn't speak the words. A no felt like a lie, an answer born of pity, but a yes felt like the deepest betrayal. So she remained silent. Her answer came not in words, but in an action. She put her mug down on the hearth and rose from her stool. She knelt before him, on the warm stones of the fireplace, and then, slowly, she lifted her hand and touched his face. His cheek was rough with stubble, his skin weathered by sun and wind, but beneath her trembling fingertips, she felt a tremor run through him, just as she had when he'd held the rifle. His eyes squeezed shut, as if her touch was a pleasure too intense to bear. She leaned in, drawn by a force she no longer had the will or desire to fight. He met her halfway, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was rough, clumsy, and desperate. A collision of months of unspoken longing, of loneliness so profound it had become a part of their very bones. It was a kiss that tasted of cider and wood smoke, and a sorrow so deep it had no name. It was raw, and it was real, and it was everything. He pulled her onto his lap, his mouth never leaving hers. In the small, snowbound cabin, with the fire dying to embers, they crossed a threshold from which there was no return. It was an act of profound, trembling discovery. She explored his body not with hesitation, but with a fierce and tender curiosity, her hands tracing the terrible, beautiful map of his scars as if to learn the language of his pain. She wanted to show him that she saw all of him, the broken parts and the strong parts, and that she chose him. For Caleb, who had believed himself unworthy of a woman's gentle touch for a decade, it was an agonizingly beautiful surrender. It was the shattering of his self-imposed exile, the quiet, terrifying realization that he was not a monster, but a man who could be wanted. Afterward, they lay tangled together under a thick fur blanket, the firelight painting their bodies in soft strokes of orange and gold. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, heavy with emotion. Emma was nestled against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. And then she felt it. A single, hot tear fell onto her hair, then another. She lifted her head and saw that he was crying. Silent, wrenching sobs shook his entire frame, his face buried in his hands. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of 10 years of unspeakable grief, guilt, and loneliness finally finding a release. She said nothing. She simply wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly as the storm of his sorrow washed over them both. She held him until the shaking subsided, until the only sound in the room was the soft whisper of the dying fire. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she would never leave. Emma awoke the next morning to a world reborn in the pale, winter light. A soft warmth curled in the pit of her stomach, a feeling so new and hopeful it was almost painful. She turned, expecting to find Caleb beside her, to meet his eyes in the quiet intimacy of the dawn. But the space next to her was empty. The fur blanket was folded neatly, and the cabin was still. She found him by the stove, his back to her, ladling coffee into a mug. He was fully dressed, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Caleb?" she said softly. He didn't turn. "Coffee's hot," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any of the raw emotion from the night before. He took his mug and headed for the door, his gait the same familiar, painful limp, the invisible wall between them, the one she thought had been shattered into a million pieces, was being rebuilt, stone by cold, silent stone. She stood there, stunned, a cold dread seeping into her limbs. All day, he avoided her. He busied himself in the barn, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He spoke only when necessary. In short, clipped sentences about the weather or the state of their firewood supply. It was as if the night of the fire, the kiss, the tears, none of it had ever happened. Emma's heart, which had felt so full and hopeful, began to ache with a deep, bruising hurt. She tried to tell herself he was just afraid, that a decade of solitude couldn't be undone in a single night. But the silence felt like a rejection, a judgment. She had offered him the most vulnerable part of herself, had held him through his own shattering grief, and in the light of day, he had retreated, leaving her utterly alone once more. The fragile companionship they had built through the winter felt like a dream she was waking from. With a heavy heart, she fell back into her own silence, and they resumed their old, separate orbits. The space between them now charged with the memory of an intimacy that had been disowned. As the winter slowly loosened its grip on the land, the snow began to melt, and the world beyond Whisperwind Ridge trickled back into their lives. A lone trapper, making his way down from the mountains, stopped by for a night, his eyes wide with surprise at the sight of Emma moving about the cabin with quiet efficiency. On their first trip to town for supplies, the change in them was palpable. They rode in the same buckboard, a comfortable silence having replaced the old, tense one. Caleb's face, though still stern, had lost some of its harshness. Emma, though still quiet, held her head with a new, resilient confidence. The town noticed. The whispers that followed them were different now. The pity was gone, replaced by a buzzing, incredulous curiosity. They were no longer the monster and his sacrifice. They were a mystery. "Look at him, Mrs." Gable muttered to a friend, just loud enough for Emma to hear. "He almost looks human." The rumor mill, starved for gossip through the long winter, began to churn. The story that took root was a fantastical one. The gentle, young bride had performed a miracle. She had tamed the beast of Whisperwind Ridge, healed the cripple with her kindness. They had become a local legend, a curiosity to be stared at and speculated about. This newfound attention brought an unwelcome visitor. One bright spring afternoon, as Emma was hanging laundry on a line, she saw a familiar, stooped figure riding up the path. Her heart sank. It was her father. Silas Hayes dismounted, his eyes darting around the ranch, taking in the repaired roof, the mended fences, the general air of order. He looked less like a concerned father and more like a man assessing an investment. Caleb came out onto the porch, his stance immediately wary. He stood taller, his broad shoulders squared, a silent protector before his home. "Blackwood," Silas said, attempting a friendly tone that didn't reach his shifty eyes. "I've come for my daughter." Caleb's face remained like stone. "She is my wife." "A bargain that's run its course," Silas pressed, stepping closer. "I've had a run of good fortune. Your debt has been settled with the mercantile. I've paid it in full. The arrangement is finished." Emma, hidden by the line of damp sheets, froze. She could hear every word, her blood turning to ice in her veins. "There is no arrangement." Caleb's voice was a low growl. "There is a marriage." "A marriage of convenience," Silas scoffed. "And the convenience is over. I have a better prospect for her now. Mr. Abernathy, the dry goods proprietor, a wealthy man, whole asterisk man. He's willing to take her, and it's a far better station in life for her than this." He waved a dismissive hand at the rugged, lonely landscape. "I'm here to take her home." From her hiding place, Emma watched Caleb. She saw the muscle in his jaw leap. She saw his hand clench into a fist at his side. She expected him to explode in anger, to throw her father off his land. But his reply, when it came, was quiet and deadly. "She is not a horse to be traded. Silas, she is not for sale." The words should have been a comfort, a declaration of her worth. But to Emma's wounded heart, they sounded entirely different. She is not for sale. Not because she was a person he cherished, but because he had already bought her. He had paid her father's debts, and she was his property now. His refusal to let her go wasn't an act of love. It was an act of ownership. It explained everything. His retreat after their night together. His coldness. It wasn't fear. It was the indifference of a man for a possession he had no emotional investment in. The intimacy they had shared had meant nothing to him. The hurt was so sharp, so blinding, it stole the breath from her lungs. The shame of her situation, of being discussed and bartered for like a piece of livestock, was a bitter poison. She couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear her father's greed, and she couldn't bear Caleb's cold possession. She waited until the confrontation was over, until her father had ridden away, sputtering with threats and indignation. She waited until Caleb had retreated to the barn, the heavy door closing with a grim finality. Then, moving like a ghost, she went into the cabin. She packed nothing. She simply put on her cloak, her hands trembling, and wrote a short, simple note on a piece of butcher paper. "I release you from your bargain." She left it on the table where he would see it, in the dead of night. She stole into the barn. She saddled the gentler of the two horses, her movements swift and silent. She led the horse as far down the path as she dared before mounting, her heart a frantic, painful drum against her ribs. She didn't look back. She rode into the darkness, away from the man she had allowed herself to love, and away from the life she could no longer endure. Caleb awoke with a jolt, his heart hammering in his chest. He'd been dreaming of the mine, of darkness and the smell of dust and the sound of his brother's fading voice. He sat bolt upright on his cot, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. The cabin was unnaturally silent. He called her name. "Emma?" There was no answer. A terrible, primal fear seized him. He scrambled from the bed, his bad leg protesting with a sharp stab of pain. He half limped, half ran into the main room. The front door was slightly ajar, letting in a thin sliver of pre-dawn gray. Her room was empty, the bed untouched, on the table. The note lay like a tombstone. "Asterisk, I release you from your bargain." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. Bargain. She thought it was still just a bargain. The night by the fire, the shared work, the quiet companionship. She thought it all meant nothing. His fear, his stupid, cowardly fear, had driven her away. He threw the door open and stumbled out into the cold. The world was a canvas of gray and white, the old snow still clinging to the shadows. And there, leading away from the barn, were the tracks, a single horse. A raw, ragged sound tore from his throat. He began to run, his mismatched gait a clumsy, desperate scramble. He ignored the fire in his leg, the strain in his lungs. He just ran, following the tracks that were already beginning to fade in the strengthening light. He pushed himself harder than he ever had, his mind screaming her name. He had to reach her, had to tell her she had misunderstood, that his silence was born of terror. Not indifference, that she wasn't his possession. She was his heart. He reached the crest of a hill and saw it, the faint, dark shape of a lone rider, already far down the path that led back to town. He tried to yell her name, but his throat was raw, and the sound was lost in the vast, empty landscape. He stumbled, his bad leg finally giving out, and fell to his knees in the snow. He was too late. He could only watch as she disappeared from view, leaving him alone on the silent, wind-swept ridge. All that remained were the faint, fading tracks in the snow, a heartbreaking testament to the woman who had touched his soul and then vanished. The town of Redemption was just as dusty and unforgiving as Emma remembered, but now it felt different. It felt like a cage. She found a small, airless room for rent above the saloon, a room that always smelled faintly of stale beer and regret. To pay for it, she took a job at that very saloon, washing dishes and serving meals to rough, loud men from sunup until well past sundown. The work was grueling, a monotonous cycle of clattering plates, greasy water, and aching feet. It was work that emptied her mind and exhausted her body, but it could not touch the hollow ache in her soul. She had run from the ranch seeking freedom, but here in town, she was more of a prisoner than ever. She was a curiosity, a fallen woman in the eyes of the townspeople. The same folks who had once pitied her as a sacrifice now looked at her with a mixture of scorn and smug superiority. They saw her as the woman who had fled the monster on the hill, a failure who couldn't even make a go of a cursed marriage. Their whispers followed her like shadows, speculating on why she had left, what horrors she had endured. They knew nothing of the quiet companionship, of the shared warmth by a winter fire, or of the man who cried silent tears in the dark. Their judgment was a constant, abrasive presence, and she felt more alone in the crowded saloon than she ever had in the vast, empty silence of Whisperwind Ridge. In the quiet, lonely hours of the night, when the noise from the saloon below finally died down, her mind would betray her. It would wander back up the dusty mountain road. She would remember things with a clarity that was excruciating. She would see the way the setting sun caught in Caleb's dark hair as he looked out over the valley, his stern face softened by the golden light. She would remember the scent of him, a clean, masculine smell of sun-baked leather, pine, and honest sweat. It was a smell that meant safety, a smell that meant home. Most vividly, she would remember the feeling of his arms around her, the solid strength of his chest against her back. She remembered the network of scars beneath his shirt, the imperfect landscape of his body that she had come to know better than her own. He was a broken man, a man of jagged edges and deep, silent sorrows. But his embrace had been the only place she had ever felt truly whole. She had run from him, believing he saw her as a possession, but the memory of his touch, his vulnerability, told a different story. The more she replayed his words, "She is not for sale," the more she realized her wounded pride had twisted their meaning. He hadn't been claiming ownership. He had been defending her honor. The realization was a slow, agonizing dawn, and with it came a regret so profound it felt like a physical illness. Weeks passed in this miserable haze. Then, one afternoon, during the busiest part of the day, she saw him. She was clearing plates from a table near the saloon's grimy front window when a figure in the bustling market street outside made her freeze. It was Caleb. He was just standing there, across the way, looking utterly out of place amidst the townsfolk. He looked thinner, his face gaunt and shadowed with a grief that was plain to see even from a distance. He was no longer the imposing figure from the ranch. He was a man hollowed out by loss. And in his hands, he was holding something. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was a dress, her simple blue calico dress, the one she had left behind in her haste. He wasn't looking at the saloon, wasn't looking for her. He was just staring down at the dress in his large, calloused hands, his posture one of utter desolation. He held it as if it were a sacred object, the last remnant of a ghost. For a long, heart-stopping minute, he stood motionless, a statue of sorrow in the middle of the crowded street. People gave him a wide berth, whispering and pointing. He seemed oblivious to them all, lost in his own private hell. Then, as if the effort was too much to bear, he slowly, carefully folded the dress. He tucked it into his saddlebag, mounted his horse with that familiar, labored motion, and rode away, his back straight, never once looking in her direction. The sight broke something inside of Emma. That night, she couldn't work. She fled to her small, suffocating room, and finally allowed the grief she had been holding at bay to consume her. She wept until her body ached, sobbing into her thin pillow. She cried for his pain, for her own foolish pride, for the terrible, tragic misunderstanding that had torn them apart. She had been so wrong. His silence hadn't been indifference, it had been fear. His retreat hadn't been rejection, it had been the terrified recoil of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be loved. And she had punished him for it. She had run away and left him alone with his ghosts. Just when he had finally found the courage to let her in, when the tears finally subsided, a calm, unshakable resolve settled over her. She knew what she had to do. There was no more pride, no more fear, only a desperate, urgent need to go back. She scribbled a hasty note for the saloon owner, leaving it on her neatly made bed along with a few coins she had earned. She didn't pack her meager belongings. They meant nothing to her. Under the cover of darkness, just as she had done when she'd left the ranch, she slipped away. This time, however, she was on foot, her heart not frantic with escape, but steady with purpose. The walk would be long and arduous, but every step felt like a step toward absolution, a step toward home. The moon was high when she was well out of town, the road a pale, dusty ribbon under the stars. The silence of the wilderness, once intimidating, now felt like a comforting embrace. She had just started the long, winding ascent toward the ridge when two shadows detached themselves from a cluster of boulders ahead. "Well, well, what's a pretty little thing like you doing out here all alone?" a gravelly voice sneered. Two men blocked her path, their faces obscured by the shadows, the silver glint of a knife blade catching the moonlight. Emma's blood ran cold. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Give us your money, and we won't hurt you," the second man said, his voice slick with menace as he advanced on her. "I don't have any money," Emma stammered, her voice trembling. "Don't lie to us," the first man snarled. grabbing her arm in a painful grip. A terrible, blinding panic seized her. She screamed, a raw, desperate sound that was swallowed by the vast, empty night. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the darkness up the ridge, a voice of pure, cold fury. "Get your hands off my wife!" Before the men could even react, the night exploded with a deafening gunshot. The knife clattered to the ground as one of the men yelped in pain, clutching his hand. The second man, seeing the dark, imposing figure limping toward them with a rifle leveled at his chest, turned and fled into the night, his partner scrambling after him. Emma was left standing in the middle of the road, trembling uncontrollably. Caleb limped into the circle of moonlight, his face a mask of grim determination, the rifle held steady in his hands. He scanned the darkness for a moment, ensuring the threat was gone, before his eyes finally settled on her. The rifle clattered to the ground. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his chest heaving, his face a maelstrom of relief, fear, and a desperate, questioning hope. That look was all it took. The last of Emma's resolve crumbled. She ran to him, stumbling over the uneven ground, and threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest. He staggered back a step. Then his arms came around her, crushing her to him in an embrace that was both fierce and trembling. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed into his shirt, her words muffled. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." "Emma," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard before. She tilted her head back, looking up at his beloved, scarred face in the moonlight. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief, of homecoming. "I'm not leaving again," she whispered, her voice fierce with promise. "I'm never leaving you again." The walk back to the ranch was a dreamlike journey through the moon-drenched landscape. They moved in a profound, unbroken silence, the crunch of their boots on the gravel path the only sound. Caleb had retrieved his rifle, but he held it loosely in one hand. With the other, he had found hers, his large, rough fingers lacing through her smaller ones, holding on with a gentle, desperate strength, as if he feared she might vanish into the night air if he let go. This simple contact, this quiet claiming, said more than 1,000 words could have. It was an apology, a promise, and a plea, all in one. When they reached the cabin, the single lantern she had left burning cast a warm, welcoming glow from the window. It looked like a beacon, a sanctuary. Inside, the space was filled with the lingering ghosts of their shared life, the smell of wood smoke, the sight of his chair by the hearth, the neatly folded blanket on her empty bed. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of her departure and the miracle of her return. Caleb released her hand and moved to the fireplace, his movements stiff and uncertain. He began to stack new logs on the embers, his broad back a wall of tension. He was retreating again. She realized, not into coldness, but into the familiar, safe territory of masculine duty. He didn't know what to do with the overwhelming relief, with the fragile hope that was blooming in his chest. He was afraid to break it. Emma watched him, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. She understood his fear because it mirrored her own, but she had run once from that fear, and she would not do it again. She had come back to fight for this, for them. She crossed the room, her footsteps soft on the wooden floorboards. She came to stand behind him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She placed a hand gently on the center of his back, right over the terrible, puckered scar. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. "Caleb," she whispered. He stopped his work, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of weary surrender. He did not turn. She moved around to face him, her hands coming up to cup his rough, stubbled cheeks. She made him look at her, her gaze steady and unwavering. His eyes were a turbulent sea of emotion, pain, regret, and a hope so fragile it was heartbreaking. "If you'll still have me," she began, her voice catching. "If you still want me, It was all she could manage to say. It was a question, an offering, and a plea of her own. She was giving him the choice, acknowledging that he, too, had been wounded by their bargain. His answer was not a word, but a shudder that ran through his entire body. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path through the grime on his cheek. He leaned into her touch, a broken man finally coming home. He then lowered his head and kissed her. This kiss was nothing like their first. There was no desperation, no roughness, no collision of lonely souls. This was a kiss of profound tenderness, a slow, deliberate exploration. It was a kiss of homecoming, of forgiveness, of a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger. It was gentle, yet it held all the power of the storms they had weathered. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to his own narrow bed, the one she had nursed him in. He laid her down with a reverence that made her heart ache, his eyes never leaving hers. What followed was not a frantic coupling, but a slow, sacred act of rediscovery. They moved together with a newfound language, one of tenderness and absolute trust. His hands, so accustomed to the hard labor of the ranch, were impossibly gentle. They explored her with a sense of wonder, as if memorizing the curve of her waist, the line of her throat, and her hands were just as reverent. She traced the long, puckered scar on his back, not with pity, but with love. She kissed the ruined flesh of his leg, her lips a silent promise that she saw no imperfection, no brokenness. She was loving his past, his pain, his survival. She was loving all the parts of him that he had hidden from the world, the parts he believed made him a monster. With every touch, every whispered endearment, she was telling him he was whole, he was beautiful, he was hers. In the quiet aftermath, they lay tangled in the dim light, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Emma was nestled in the crook of his arm, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring drum of his heart. The silence that fell was not empty or awkward. It was full, a peaceful, contented quiet. "I never thought—" Caleb's voice was a low, rough whisper against her hair. He stopped, swallowed hard, and started again. "I never thought I was worthy of being loved. Not after Joseph." He said the name with a quiet agony, but without the fevered desperation of before. It was an admission, a confession of the deepest, darkest belief that had shaped his life for a decade. He believed his scars, both inside and out, made him unlovable. Emma lifted her head, propping herself up on an elbow so she could look at him. She reached out and gently brushed a lock of dark hair from his forehead. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears, but her voice was strong and clear. "When I first saw your scars, Caleb, I saw a man's pain," she said softly. "But when I held you that night, when you were lost in the fever, that was the night I touched your soul, and I saw nothing but light." His breath hitched. He stared at her, his eyes wide with a raw, astonished vulnerability. Her words were a balm, a healing ointment on a wound he thought would never close. She didn't just accept his darkness, she denied it existed, seeing only the goodness he thought he had lost forever in that mine. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and held her, simply held her, for a long, long time. There were no more tears, just the profound, peaceful certainty of two broken halves finally made whole. The next morning marked the beginning of their true life together. A new energy pulsed through the ranch, an energy of hope and shared purpose. They became a team, a true partnership. Together, they drew up plans, not just for surviving, but for thriving. They chose a spot on the south-facing slope, protected from the wind, and began the back-breaking work of digging a new, deeper well. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, synchronized rhythm. He taught her how to read the soil, and she helped him build a stone wall around a plot of land for a vegetable garden. For the first time, the ranch would have more than just salted pork and beans. It would have tomatoes, squash, and corn. It would have life. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their shared labor a joyful act of creation, building a future with their own 4 hands. Weeks later, when they needed supplies, they rode into town together. This time, there was no space between them on the buckboard seat. Emma sat close beside him, and as they reached the main street, Caleb reached over and took her hand in his. He held it firmly, possessively, not as an owner, but as a proud husband. Their arrival caused a stir. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. The sight of Caleb Blackwood, the beast of Whisperwind Ridge, walking down the street hand in hand with his wife, was a spectacle no one had anticipated. They saw a man who walked with a limp. Yes, but who held his head high, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. They saw a woman who was not a frightened, browbeaten victim, but a woman who radiated a calm, luminous happiness. They were a strange pair, forged in hardship and isolation, their love story a thing of whispers and wild speculation. But as they stood together at the counter of the mercantile, their hands linked, their private smiles speaking of a world no one else could enter, they were undeniably, incandescently, a couple, a strange and beautiful couple, radiant against the endless red dust of the West. A year passed, measured not in months, but in the slow, steady transformation of the land and the people who tended it. Spring arrived on Whisperwind Ridge not as a hesitant visitor, but as a triumphant conqueror. The harsh red earth, once cracked and barren, was now softened by carpets of green grass and dotted with the vibrant colors of Indian paintbrush and desert marigold. The 2 men saw that had been their winter companion now rested in the barn, its work replaced by the joyful sounds of life. New calves, spindly-legged and curious, gamboled in the pastures, their lowing calls a constant, gentle music. The new well, a testament to their shared labor, was deep and full, its water clear and sweet, and the small vegetable garden, protected by its stone wall, was a riot of green shoots, promising a harvest of plenty. The ranch was no longer a place of exile. It was a sanctuary, a thriving testament to what 2 determined souls could build from dust and determination. The most profound change, however, was growing quietly within Emma. One warm afternoon, as she stood on the porch watching Caleb mend a harness, a wave of dizziness washed over her, followed by a sudden, deep-seated knowing. She waited until he was finished, until he came to stand beside her, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He followed her gaze out over the valley, a comfortable silence settling between them, as it so often did now. She took his large, calloused hand and placed it gently on her lower belly. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Your son or daughter is saying hello." He froze, his hand splaying instinctively against her. He looked from her face to her stomach and back again, his dark eyes wide with a stunned, uncomprehending wonder. The tough, stoic rancher, the man who had faced down wolves and his own demons, was utterly undone by a life he couldn't yet see. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile of pure, incandescent joy that transformed his stern features and made him look years younger. He said nothing. Instead, he moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his own hand covering hers on the gentle swell of her belly. They stood like that for a long time, watching the sun begin its slow descent, 2 figures silhouetted against the vast, promising landscape. "I'm never letting you go again," he murmured into her hair, his voice a low, fierce promise. It wasn't a threat of ownership, but a vow of protection, a final, definitive answer to the question he had asked her by the fire so long ago. He was binding her to him not with a bargain, but with a future. One day, an unexpected rider appeared on the path. It was Silas Hayes. He sat on his horse, gaping openly at the scene before him. He saw the flourishing garden, the healthy cattle, the sturdy, well-maintained fences. He saw a ranch that was no longer on the brink of ruin, but was prosperous and growing. When Caleb emerged from the barn, Silas's jaw tightened. This was not the broken, haunted man he had tried to intimidate a year ago. Caleb walked with his familiar limp, but his shoulders were back. His head was high, and his eyes were clear and steady. There was an aura of quiet authority about him that Silas had never seen. "Emma," he called out, dismounting. "I've come to see how you are." Emma came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her belly was a gentle, rounded curve beneath the fabric. She looked at her father, and for the first time, she felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not even the dull ache of old wounds. She felt only a great, calm distance. He was a stranger who had played a role in the beginning of her story, but he was no longer a part of it. "I am well, father," she said, her voice polite but cool. His eyes flickered from her pregnant form to Caleb, who had come to stand beside her, his arm resting protectively around her waist. A flicker of calculation, of missed opportunity, crossed Silas's face. "It seems you've done well for yourself, Blackwood," he said, a grudging respect in his tone. "We've done well for ourselves," Caleb corrected him, his voice calm but firm, his use of "we" a clear and deliberate statement. They offered him a drink of water, which he accepted, but the conversation was stilted and brief. The chasm between their new life and his old one was too wide to bridge. He soon rode away, a stooped figure of regret, leaving them in the peaceful quiet of the world they had built. Emma watched him go, not with forgiveness, for some things could not be forgiven, but without bitterness. Her life was too full of love to have any room left for hate. That summer, the town of Redemption held its annual Founders' Day festival. The main street was festooned with bunting, the air filled with the sounds of laughter, fiddle music, and the smell of roasting corn. In years past, Caleb would have sooner walked through fire than into that crowd, but this year was different. He walked down the main street with Emma on his arm, and for the first time since the mine explosion over a decade ago, he walked without a cane. His gait was still uneven, his limp a permanent part of who he was, but he moved with a slow, deliberate confidence. He did not lean on Emma for support. He walked beside her as an equal, his presence a quiet declaration of his own strength. Emma, her face glowing, her belly round and full under her simple dress, smiled at the faces that turned to watch them. The whispers that followed them now were not of scorn or pity, but of awe. They saw the man who had been a recluse, a monster in their stories, now walking among them with his beautiful, expectant wife, his eyes filled not with ghosts, but with a clear, steady light. Mrs. Gable, standing outside her bakery, simply stared, her mouth slightly agape, as if she were witnessing a miracle. The legend of the beast of Whisperwind Ridge was dead. In its place, a new story was being told, a story whispered from neighbor to neighbor with a sense of wonder. They called him the man who rose from the ashes. They spoke of his resilience, of his wife's devotion, and of the love that had somehow healed a man everyone else had written off as hopelessly broken. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the festival, they left the noise and the crowds behind and made their way home. The day had been a triumph, a final, public affirmation of their new life. But their truest peace was here, on the quiet ridge. They stood together on the porch of the cabin, the same porch where they had been married in a loveless, windswept ceremony 2 years before. Now, it was a place of sanctuary. The setting sun painted the sky in breathtaking strokes of crimson and gold, bathing their transformed ranch in a warm, gentle light. Caleb slipped his arm around Emma's shoulders, and she leaned into his strength, her hand resting on top of his over their unborn child. His hand was no longer a stranger's, but the most familiar and comforting thing in the world. Her presence was not a duty, but the very anchor of his soul. They looked out at the land, at the healthy cattle grazing peacefully, at the garden promising life, at the sturdy home they had fortified together. They had taken a place of hardship and isolation, and, with nothing but their own broken pieces, had built a paradise. He was no longer the cripple, and she was no longer the sacrifice. They were just Caleb and Emma, a man and a woman who had found in each other's scars the map to their own healing. He tightened his grip on her hand, their fingers lacing together in a silent, unbreakable bond. They stood side by side, watching the last of the light fade, their hearts full, their gazes fixed on the horizon, with no more fear. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment below and let's connect. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the frontier, and don't forget to share your thoughts on Caleb and Emma's journey.